Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our third guest is Professor Michael Ignatieff, who is a Canadian author, academic, and former politician. He is known for his work as a historian and has held senior academic posts at the University of Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, and Toronto. He served as the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and the leader of the official opposition from 2008 until 2011. After retiring from active politics in 2011, he continued his academic pursuits, teaching at the University of Toronto and Harvard Kennedy School. Most recently, he served as the rector and president of Central European University from 2016 until 2021. He continues to publish articles and essays on international affairs as well as Canadian politics. His latest book is On Consolation. Professor Ignatieff, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Nice to be here, Zalán.
We are going to talk about the West and the challenges it is facing. But before delving into its quandaries, I'm curious about your point of view on the key to the West's success. Mm-hmm. In my perspective, I was influenced by Larry Seedentop's book, The Inventing the Individual and the Origins of Western Liberalism. And I think that Professor Seedentop is right in arguing that it was Christianity that called into being the individual with free will and dignity. And, the theory is that no king has rule over individual consciousness but God. It is his argument. And it gave farewell to the ancient ethics based on determinism, according to which that everything is under the rule of the logos. And slaves were considered to be the living tools by Aristotle, for example, and women could not be fully rational agents, merely seen as mistakes. And according to Seedentop, St. Paul turned the world upside down, and Christianity liberated the individual from the deterministic logos of antiquity and planted the seeds of individualism. And later, this individual, through, of course, bloodsheds and enormous struggles, could cage the power. It is just my personal opinion, but what is your point of view about this interpretation, and in what do you see the success of Western civilization?
Well, who am I to disagree with Larry Seedentop? Larry is a person I know and respect, and I think it's a very good place to start. That is to put an emphasis on the individualism of Western culture, and that's a counterintuitive way to do it because much of Western culture is harshly criticized for being too individualistic. Larry is arguing that, in fact, it's the moral individualism that is the driver of Western civilization, and that seems roughly right. And the revolutionary message of Christianity, which you get in St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians, there is neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, but all are one in Jesus Christ. That is, it's not just the individualism, it's the distinctive equality of all persons in the Christian message, which is revolutionary. And so it's this combination of individualism and equality that I think detonates the energies that lead to the rise of the West. And then there's some other factors which have to do with geography, which have to do with the ways in which the Mediterranean becomes a kind of transport link that draws these societies together, advantages of climate, advantages of all kinds of geographic, even geological factors. I think it's important to put those material factors beside the moral factors that you adduce. But there's no question that's, I think, you put that package together and you have a story of the West dominance. And you then also have to add the intellectual traditions, the development of astronomy, the development of science, some of it coming not just from Christian sources, but also from Arab sources, and the way those Arab and Muslim sources reinvigorated European science. So you've got a very complicated picture, and you have to put in colonialism and empire. There's no question that Western civilization built itself on the back of the exploitation of Latin America in the first instance, North America in the second instance. You can't go to Spain and look at the staggering achievements of Spanish civilization in the 15th and 16th century without thinking about Peruvian, Colombian, Mexican silver and gold miners and all that they suffered. So you got to put the whole story in. And I think it's important when thinking about the West not to gloss over the dark and emphasize only the light. It's all of it. And unless you factor in the history of colonialism and empire, you can't understand the enduring resentment of parts of Africa and Asia, even Latin America, towards the achievements of the West. I cede to no one in my admiration for the achievements of the West, but you can't discuss the West unless you own and take responsibility for all of it, would be my point.
And I think that more and more people, especially from the radical side of the ideological spectrum, tend to see the West as being in decline. Just for instance, the Hungarian Prime Minister. And however, this is nothing new under the sun. Oswald Spengler was one of the main champions of this idea. And even though it is more than an ideology, I think, than an empirically well underpinned observation, in my opinion, owing to the harmful nature of such thoughts, we should discuss what the roots of this disillusionment of the West are. So I wouldn't call it a decline, but rather a change that might turn out to be the seeds of a probable decline in the future. And personally, I detect two main problems that I'm curious about your opinion. The first one is what Max Weber calls the Entzauberung der Welt, so disenchanted world. And after the death of God, and I think that Thomas Hardy raised the question beautifully in his poem, The God's Funeral, that whoever shall fill this place, whither the wanderers turn their distracted eyes to some fixed stars to stimulate their peace, their place, whither towards the goal of their enterprise. I think it was the correct quotation. We lost so I think we lost these fixed stars, not only in the transcendental and ethical way, but also with each other. And we lost the sense of togetherness, as Charles Taylor would argue. And I'm very much interested in how you see this phenomenon, whether you see such dramatic change in our concept of being a human person.
Boy, you're making me work early in the morning. I hadn't expected to have to work so hard. Look, you started with Orbán and the decline of the West, and there you're looking at a highly ideological attack on the West that is so full of bad faith, it's impossible to know where to begin. He accuses the West of moral relativism, sexual permissiveness, and all kinds of stuff that, it'd look a lot better if it weren't such a corrupt, thieving regime with so much moral cynicism at its core, so much systematic dismantling of what, in fact, is one of the West's foundational achievements, which is democracy. I don't take any lectures about the decline of the West from a person who's systematically engaged in dismantling one of the West's greatest achievements, which is democratic freedom. And so I'm simply deaf to what he has to say. I'm uninterested in what he has to say. There are other arguments about the decline of the West that I take more seriously. Not Oswald Spengler. You mentioned Spengler, and you're right to mention that Spengler's doom and gloom about the West was helped to prepare some of the fascist attack on democracy in the 30s. So I don't have, again, I find those attacks essentially in bad faith. The criticism of the West from the inside that I think everybody has to take seriously is, what are the consequences of secularization? What are the consequences of the decreasing hold of religious faith on modern people? And here, there's been a divide for centuries over this. The French Revolution was, in some sense, very much about this, an anti-religious and a pro-religious force fighting it out for the future of France. I side with those who feel that secularization was an important liberation of human beings from the dead weight of religious authority and emancipated people to ask ultimate questions about the basis of moral life and ask ultimate questions about the nature of the cosmos. But freedom, the freedom that resulted is often frightening, because people feel that the West has created an individual who's unmoored from any set of traditional anchors in religious or customary belief. So in the West, there's a deep disquiet about the consequences of secularization. I'm a convinced believer that, and my latest book on constellation essentially says this, that in place of the decline of religious faith, we found other forms of consolation. We've been extremely inventive in creating rituals and forms of solidarity, which give us a sense of belonging and meaning in the world. And so the criticism of Western civilization that says we're all amoral, rootless, relativist individuals engaged in a deathly struggle of competitive capitalism, and it's all horrible, seem to me to grotesquely overstate the problem and to fail to recognize the sense in which, if you ask yourself honestly, you just cut the intellectual stuff and ask, where would you like to be born? What place in the world would you like to be born because you feel that would give you the most life chances? The answer is somewhere in a Western society, for all its problems. You would want to be born in the United States. You would want to be born where I'm talking to you, in Vienna. You might even want to be born in Hungary with all its problems. You probably wouldn't want to be born in Iran, in a theocracy. You might not want to be born in China. You might not want to be born in Russia, not because Russia and China are uniquely evil places. That's not my point. But they are places where your life possibilities, your life chances, your chances of shaping your life as you wish might be, I don't say would be, might be constrained by regime change and changes in the political climate such that your life chances would simply disappear. And so, again, you come back to what the West has uniquely offered, which is this very demanding, very emotionally taxing form of freedom. And if you ask me where I want to be born, I want to be born, and I want my children to be born in societies that offer that kind of freedom.
Yeah. I believe that one of the main problems, or not the problems, but questions of the West, the quandaries, is redefining, the redefinition of what it means to be human. And I think one of the greatest examples is artificial intelligence. As I believe that owing to this disenchantment, as I mentioned before, people are hoodwinked by the utopia mantra of techno-optimists such as Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. And intellectual history is filled with these utopias, but most of them remained on the pages of pamphlets such as Thomas More's Utopia or Bacon's New Atlantis. However, several of them attempted to alter the reality according to their wants, like Marxism, we Hungarians know it. With the rise of artificial intelligence, these techno-optimists want to create such a utopian future by creating a surrogate reality. And this project, I think, that is mandated by modern economics and this relentless effort to find the perfect equilibrium for Mill's Homo economicus by eliminating its disturbing causes from the system just to create the ideal accreditation and abstract models. And so it is not the human person in the 21st century with free will, but rather abstract algorithms without having legal culpability, by the way, that are the new agency of socio-economic actions. And first, do you agree with this diagnosis? And secondly, would you estimate the consequences of taking man and machine, as Geoffrey de la Mettrie mentioned? And I think your colleague Tim Crane wrote a brilliant book about it with his artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence is currently controlled and elaborated and developed by 3 or 4 companies, because the sheer computing costs of developing these models of artificial intelligence are staggeringly high, billions and billions of dollars. So it's concentrated in very small hands. And in some sense, the most serious problem posed by artificial intelligence is simply the problem of monopoly capitalism. It's simply the problem of very few agents having the enormous resources necessary to develop the technology. And so those are the techno-optimists are a problem because they have monopoly control of the means of production in Marxist terms. And so our regulatory problem is to make sure that they don't start controlling states, controlling democracies, controlling everything with the deployment of these technologies that are a source of immense amounts of profit. So there's that problem. But I think there are other problems which are that cut to the definition of what is a human. I mean, I work on this a little because I sit on the advisory board of Oxford Ethics in AI at Oxford University. And what strikes me most about the techno-optimism is the systematic blurring of the very clear distinction between machine computation and human intelligence. I'd go so far as to say that even using the word artificial intelligence blurs the distinction. What we're talking about is extremely empowered computation using enormous amounts of data that have never been available for computation before. But there's a strict distinction between computation and intelligence. What you and I are doing at this moment is not computation. What we're engaged in is a human conversation in which I'm looking at, you're just nodded, so I'm looking at what you're saying, and you're telling me, you're sending me a signal that you understand what I'm saying, and you're beginning to break into a smile, and so I'm cheered up and thinking, well, I'm getting my message through, and on we go. It's a standard, banal human interchange of baffling complexity. I mean, it's just no computer can even begin to model the complexity of what's happening at this very moment. Human intelligence is an extremely sophisticated operation that's both, it does have computational aspects, it does have logical aspects, but it also has bodily aspects. You know, we're not brains in vats, we're brains inside bodily systems. We're biological creatures as well as machines. And the whole artificial intelligence discussion is absolutely bedeviled by what I would call illicit anthropomorphism. That is, absolutely illicit, irrational attribution to machines of human qualities that they do not possess. And the net effect of that is that it diminishes our respect or even our understanding of what is distinctively human about human reason. And that does worry me. We're not bloody machines. We're human beings. And the sooner we understand and defend what is specific to human reason, the sooner we'll be able to begin to develop the regulation we need. Let me give you an example. I think if I were to authorize an algorithm which would be able to assess the evidence against you and decide that you were guilty of a crime. Let's suppose, Zalán, you might have committed a crime. And instead of putting you in front of a human judge, we put you in front of essentially a machine that would assess all the evidence against you and then send you down and might deprive you of your liberty. There's something about that that bothers everybody, the idea that a machine would judge and sentence you to detention. Now, what is it that bothers us? Because it might be that a machine would get the answer, would assess the evidence more soberly and rationally than our judges, who are not noticeably fair on all occasions. But what bothers us is that sentencing in a criminal matter is a deeply human interaction in which one human being sentences another and deprives them of their liberty. And what we want in that exchange is a human-to-human responsibility. And we don't want to transfer that to a machine. We might want to use a machine to assess the evidence, but we want to make sure at all points that this human-to-human responsibility is maintained. But we have to damn well understand what it is to be human. And my objection to the techno-optimists, therefore, are two. One, they have too much economic power. And secondly, they don't understand what a human being is. So we have to fix that. We have to fight back, and I'm sure we will.
Yeah, and I think another problem rises from what you mentioned. We don't know what a human being is. And
well, we do. I mean, the great strength of the Western tradition is that it's one long interrogation about what it is to be a human, which is what it is to suffer, what it is to learn, what it is to fail, what it is to make mistakes, what it is to love someone, what it is to care for someone. Our culture, the entirety of Western culture, is one long interrogation of that question. So we've got a hell of a lot to go on. And
I agree, but probably many of us have forgotten.
That's why I'm not pessimistic about any of it, because I think we simply need to have confidence in the cultural record that we've accumulated over millennia. And that record is superb. I also want to make it clear that the only tradition I know is Western tradition, but there's no reason to suppose it's superior to any other. I mean, I've been to Japan, the only other non-Western culture I've been to, and I thought, wow, this is an amazing self-contained world with an understanding what it is to be human that is recognizable and intelligible. It's not mine, but it's pretty fantastic. And I've been to Islamic cultures and thought, you know, there is beauty and wealth and richness of understanding what it is to be human. So I don't want to be ethnocentric. I'm just saying the only culture I have any grasp of is Western, and so that's the one I go with. But all cultures are inventories of what it is to be human, and I have zero worry that these wretched techno-optimists are going to drive that weight of culture from the field. I mean, that would be much too pessimistic.
I think another problem derives from this question, and personally speaking, I spent 2 months in the United States in the summer. And while talking with people in their 20s, so with my peers, I was astonished several times by hearing how woke ideology discriminates against people who has other opinion. And the academic literature refers to wokeness, as far as I know, as a secular religion, or in other words, an opium of the people, as Marx argued. So due to their politically incorrect demeanor, university professors are being fired, and I've heard it in the US as well. And as Charles Taylor argues in a much more sophisticated way than I do, so rather than just following the self-creating, and I think he used the word self-fashioning nature of authenticity, human beings should also engage in social actions and follow social rules and norms. And what is your general opinion about this identity crisis in the West? Because later I would like to discuss the far-right version of it, but now this woke sexual ideology, because you teach at the American or partly American university as well.
It's difficult to know what to think exactly. I think some of wokeism is basically a very old problem in new form, which is just conformity. Academic life is recurrently swept by fashions of moral fashions. I've been in and out of academic life for 50 years, and I can remember when Marxism was all the rage, and so you tailored everything. You did Marx speak, and then it was deconstruction speak, and then it's Althusserian speak, and then it's some other speak. This is a depressing fact about academic life, but it simply tells you that there are very few people at any time in a university prepared to think an original thought. Most of us, and I include myself, have conformist elements. We want to go along to get along. So I think some of it's just a very old standard human weakness, which is that we're susceptible to fashion. There are fashions in intellectual life, just as there are fashions in clothes. I am extremely conformist in the clothing I wear. I'm not extravagant or original in the way I dress, and I may not be extravagant or original in the way I think. So I think wokeism is just, as I would call it, the tyranny of fashion on intellectual freedom. And it's on the left, and it's moralizing, and it's and then it draws upon a sense that the achievements of my generation, a generation born after the Second World War, the great achievement of our generation was the part we played in liberating women, or helping women to achieve freedom, helping gay people to achieve freedom, helping Black people to achieve some measure of freedom. It's what I've called in other publications the rights revolution. And this rights revolution has been, in my view, an enormously positive development. I would not want to go back to the late 50s and 60s when gay men and women were in the closet, when, I'm old enough to remember stopping in a Virginia gas station as a child and seeing a sign that said, Blacks go to the washroom there and whites go to the washroom there. We need to remember what we've overcome in our lifetime. And similarly, women unable to get reliable birth control as late as 1963, unable to get any access to abortion until whenever. And so these are gains of an incalculable kind, and some aspects of the conservative counter-revolution want to roll that back, and I don't want that to happen. Now, the negative side of this rights revolution has been a kind of egalitarian moralism that insists that everything we do has to be driven towards equalizing life chances for women, Blacks, gays, trans, whatever. And that can have some negative consequences for intellectual freedom and for equality itself. That is, there are a lot of white men of slightly younger age than me who feel that every time a job comes up in academic life, they have no chance simply because of the priority given to Black, gay, or whatever, to minorities. So group identities come to exert a very strong pressure on the other value we have, which is each to count for one and no one to count for more than one. The democratic principle of equality is under strain from the pressure of these group identities. That's a real issue and has to be solved. And the Supreme Court of the United States has recently decided that you can't use racial identities to guide selection for university campuses. And I actually think that's right. So what I would substitute is, wealth, and just make sure that bright kids who don't have the resources get into college, whether they're black, brown, green, or blue. But so I see woke is producing a counter reaction. Woke is a kind of conformity that we need to overthrow, because at the end of the day, what matters is the intellectual freedom of individuals. And to some extent, modern American academic life has sacrificed a great deal of intellectual freedom for the sake of a certain kind of political correctness. But I think that's going to be blown apart, because people can't stand that kind of coercion and conformity, and the rebellion against woke is going to sweep it away.
Yeah. So do you see it as a temporal problem? Because one of my guests argued that wokeness and the whole identity crisis is the temporal problem. Climate change is much more important than dealing with it. So do you see it as a temporal problem?
I think woke is a fashion, is what I said before. It's like in a while there'll be a reaction to it. I mean, we should never underestimate the turbulence, the churn of modern intellectual life, the speed with which one fashion is replaced with another. But at all times, the challenge remains the same, which is just how to think an independent thought and think for yourself. And I've struggled my entire life as a old 1960s liberal to think for myself and not to be captured by ideologies of the left, ideologies of the right, or even by the ideologies of liberalism, which is my intellectual home. At all points, you want to be inspired by what you read, inspired by what you heard, contradicted by what you hear, and somehow find an equilibrium that's genuinely your own, where you can say, I believe this to be true. And that's a struggle in intellectual life that goes on from the moment you can think to the moment you die. And it's the condition of being a free person.
Yeah. But on the other side of the coin, there is not only the woke problem, but the far-right populism as well. So I think instead of creating their own identities, people tend to follow the crowd, as the behavior of the masses were marvelously described by Elias Canetti as well, I think, in his Crowds and Power. And by doing so, those who feel left out of the technological revolution and more feel like a victim rather than beneficiaries of its achievements become so enamored with the populist leaders' promises that they are essentially drinking the Kool-Aid. So how threatening do you find the populist nationalist movement? And is it just a temporal solution as well?
Well, I think that unlike woke, I think the populist right-wing challenge to democracy is more enduring because it's now anchoring itself in institutions across Europe. Hungary is a very sinister and important example of that. I mean, Orbán has been in power since 2010, and there are many projections that he's going to be in power until he drops off his perch. And what he's done to the democratic institutions of Hungary and what he's done to Hungary's tradition of freedom is in my view, nothing short of catastrophic. He's used democracy to dismantle democracy, and that's a tremendously dangerous model that Kaczynski has then tried in Poland, and fortunately the Polish civil society has been sufficiently strong to push that back. And what he's done in Hungary, however, is to depoliticize the entire society, to reduce it to a kind of cowed state of silence. I spend a certain amount of time in Hungary because I'm married to a Hungarian, and I love many things about Hungary, especially its traditions of freedom, intellectual freedom, moral freedom, political freedom. And those have been absolutely silenced and crushed by a form of tyranny which constantly iterates that it's democratic, that it is enacting the will of the people, and yet uses the will of the people and democratic mandates achieved in elections to basically dismantle the counter-majoritarian protections of individual freedom that on which a democracy depends, and then, having done that, to basically steal everything that can't be literally ripped out of the wall. And this is enormously serious model that it's no accident that conservative American politicians come to Budapest to pay court to the master, because he's demonstrating what you do. That is, you use democracy to dismantle democracy. And we have reason to worry that Mr. Trump will try to do the same in the United States. The Argentinians have just elected a right-wing populist. In a catastrophic economic situation, they've turned to a man who wants to basically, dismantle the central bank and convert the Argentinian currency to the dollar and strip out the government and all this stuff. And this will, in my view, only pitch a great country, Argentina, ever further closer to the abyss. So there's a global phenomenon going on here. And the wider context of this is China. By many accounts, the biggest economy in the world, is a thoroughly authoritarian police state, a tyranny. Russia has consolidated authoritarianism, using, again, democracy as a kind of fig leaf for total repression and domination. So a very large part of the world is actively going in the direction of authoritarianism and authoritarian populism, and the prospects for liberal democracy are not terrific. And within healthy Western democracies, there's a constant battle between a vision of democracy as majority rule and a vision of democracy as power checking power to keep the people free. I'm a liberal, and that means I believe that what democracy is power checking power to keep the people free. It's not majority rule. Majority rule is essential to the legitimating function of democracy, but once someone has won a majority in a democratic vote, his power or her power is subject to the countervailing power of a court, a free media, regulatory agencies, and the power of public opinion. And that's the genius of Western liberal democracy. And that's in very, very serious trouble everywhere. Brexit was an exercise in majority rule that has had catastrophic effects for Britain. The GDP loss from leaving the European Union is beginning to be measured, and majority rule is now condemning a great country that in some sense invented liberal democracy to decades and decades of subpar economic performance as a result. So yes, I'm extremely concerned about the ways in which the West's signal achievement, which is this institutional equilibrium between the power of the people and the power of institutions to regulate the power of the people, that precious balance that was achieved in 19th century Europe after the excesses of the French Revolution, there is a genuine risk that we will lose this. And part of the reason we'll lose it is the populist revolt against elites. There's anger at educated people like me sitting and talking down and patronizing to ordinary people. So there's social resentment at elites that quickly transfers to resentment at the institutions that these elites preside over. So people are resentful of judges, they're resentful of professors, they're resentful of experts, they're resentful of lawyers, they're resentful, in other words, of the entire middle class that runs the institutions that provide counter-majoritarian balance to majority rule. So there's a social dimension to the attack on majority rule, on liberal counter-majoritarian institutions that's very concerning. And among the counter-majoritarian institutions that I would include is the university. We need to think of the university as one of the counter-majoritarian institutions. Our function basically is to sit here as experts and try and teach students what we think is true on the basis of the disciplines we teach. And our function essentially is to curate the knowledge and produce the knowledge that society uses to make its social choices. And that's why we need to be independent. We need to be independent so that we can perform that function on behalf of democracy. It's not very popular. We don't do it very well. I mean, many of our universities, as we said earlier, are taken over by a lot of woke ideology of a feeble and stupid kind. But when we're doing our jobs, we're assessing the truth claims that societies use to make their decisions. And that's a fundamental function of the kind of counter-majoritarian institutions we need to keep free. And I'm worried that there's constant pressure on universities, and Orbán threw us out of Hungary because he wanted to wage war against George Soros, but he also fundamentally hates counter-majoritarian institutions that impose any obstacle to his unbridled rule. That's what's going on.
Yeah, you experienced it in person.
It was an important that, and I've never forgotten. I mean, I've never forgotten the moment in May 2017 when 80,000 Hungarians crossed the Chain Bridge and walked past our building into Parliament Square, chanting "Free universities in a free society." Now, they got it in one. They understood exactly why universities like CU matter in Hungary, and why the takeover of Hungarian institutions by the Orbán regime is so serious for Hungarian democracy, let alone Hungarian academic life.
Yeah, I participated in this demonstration, by the way. But I believe that Hungarian society is extremely hierarchical. So as the country was under the rule of foreign empires several times, I think it lacks the proper historical foundations to build a bottom-up society. It organized in a top-down way in many aspects of social life. And this is why the Hungarian social contract is not about the people, putting cap on the government's authority to prevent potential abuse of power. As Lord Acton once argued, that power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there was no chance for the Western type of individual with autonomy and dignity to take root. And having realized what the Hungarian vicious circle is, the current government attempts to restrict, as you mentioned, the freedom of individuals. Mm-hmm. And as Peter Rona argued, that it defines the core foundation of society, not in the individual, but in the more abstract family, mm-hmm. which by not having a soul is unable to act as a free agent and participate in demonstrations, strikes, for example, just in order to fight for its human rights and rebel against the government.
Well, I don't know. I think all I can say is I hope you're wrong, because you're basically saying Hungary has not created free. Hungary has a democracy, but it doesn't have any Democrats. It doesn't have any free individuals. I just hope you're wrong. I mean, because I think that's too pessimistic. I mean, I understand that Hungary has a distinct history, but come on, the Czechs are doing a little better. The Poles are doing a lot better. Don't give up on yourself. I don't understand why the Hungary that I visit all the time is full of sullen, resentful, angry people who know what this regime is doing, but can't seem to mobilize. My sense of it is that it's a political failure. There's absolutely no one on the opposition who can get together and say, this is where we're going, this is what we want. So I locate the problem not among the people, but I locate the problem in the political opposition. It's not my job. I'm not a Hungarian citizen, and I may just be wrong, but I do feel if there was leadership, a lot of the anger, the sullen, resentful fatalism that I see everywhere in Hungary when I'm there might shift quite quickly.
Yeah, I hope that I'm wrong, but I think that if you look at the Hungarian history, the situation, the pattern was always the same. Under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a strong government and roughly a weak opposition. And under the Horthy regime, so during the interwar period, the situation was roughly the same. A very strong government, an anti-democratic government, and a very weak opposition, maybe under the government. And under the Soviet rule in Kadar, it was roughly the same, and now there is Orbán. So there is a pattern in the Hungarian history, but I hope that I'm too pessimistic. But what do you think?
The pattern, but just to follow that thought, but the pattern always leads to disaster.
Yeah. You're right.
He led the country to disaster and to the extermination of 500,000 of your fellow citizens. Yeah. Kadar led to, kept the show on the road, but it was hardly a triumphant success. And I confidently predict that Orbán will lead the country eventually to disaster. I mean, where does this campaign against Brussels lead? It leads to exit. You want to exit? Fine, exit. See how warm the temperature is when you exit from the European Union. See how nice it is to, rely on China and Russia to get you through the next winter. I mean, my view of this is, yes, there are stable patterns in Hungarian history, but why do you keep repeating the damn mistake?
Yeah, you're right. And we are the black sheep of the European Union, unfortunately, today.
And you shouldn't, because the thing that's ghastly to me, I look at the polls that say some of the most Europeans in Europe are Hungarian. There's a huge opportunity there for someone to get up and say, you want to be Europeans? I'll take you back to Europe.
You experienced the witch hunting around CEU, and you, as you have mentioned, almost everything, the negative consequences of Hungarian political systems. What is your advice to Hungarian people?
My advice to the Hungarian people, stand up and fight. I mean, what I find suffocating when I'm there, frankly, is that I've always met wonderful Hungarians, subtle, thoughtful, well-read, also the people who, do the ordinary jobs that we hire them to do, wonderful people, who have a deep awareness of the cynicism and the corruption of the government they're under, but just submit because they don't see any alternative. And I just think it's crucial to create an alternative. I don't want to get into Hungarian politics. I don't have any contact with the opposition. I don't have any credibility since I'm not a citizen, but I just think for the honor of the country, there needs to be a national opposition to this regime. Because this regime is poison for Europe, and it's poison for liberal democracy. This is a much bigger issue than just Hungary. This guy is poison. He's harmful we started our conversation talking about the West. What is the West? The West is liberal democracy. That's what it's achieved. This vision that everyone counts for one and no one counts for more than one, that individual conscience and ethics matter, and that we form a political community of equals to create better lives for all of us. That's Western civilization in a nutshell. And who is doing more than anybody I can think of to destroy that vision? than the prime minister of your country. And that's a serious business. And I can't do anything about it, but Hungarians can get up and say, this is a disgrace. This is too much. This is enough. Enough is enough. We're a country that produced Sándor Petőfi. We're a country that produced Lajos Kossuth. There was a Hungary in the 19th century where a Hungarian went around the United States and everybody greeted him as a symbol of freedom. I mean, you've got these fantastic poets who protested against the tyranny of the Horthy years. You have fantastic writers and intellectuals who stood up to Kadar and were an example to all of Europe in the 70s and 80s. And now what is there in Hungary? Silence. Well, this is time to stop that. I mean, and I don't like the position I'm in because it sounds as if I'm some arrogant know-it-all from some place like Canada where they don't have any problems. And why am I lecturing you? I'm not. I'm pleading because I care about the country. I mean, I married one. I have family in Hungary. But I just feel a sense of anger and despair at what's currently being allowed by a great people in a great country and a great culture.
Yeah. It's a good final word. I can agree with you. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I remain just one plus one question. May you recommend a book or books that made great impact on you to create your worldview about the Western civilization?
Well, it's an odd choice, but there's a wonderful book called Radical Hope by a great professor from Chicago. And for some ridiculous reason, I can't remember his name, but it's called Radical Hope. And it's a reflection based, it's Jonathan Lear, L-E-A-R, Radical Hope. And it's a philosopher's reflection on a very unique text, a text written by an Aboriginal leader in the American Midwest in the 19th century, who saw his tribe nearly wiped out by disease, Western settlement, and losses in the wars with other Indian tribes. And this is a memoir of how that tribe survived the collapse of their culture and the slow return of their culture. And it's a story of the cultural survival of that tribe despite everything. And it's a very moving, Lear has a very moving set of reflections about what we can learn from an Aboriginal people who've survived absolute destruction. And to the degree that our civilization might be in danger of extinction because of climate change, because of nuclear war, because of the collapse of democracy, this is a text that's very relevant. We have a lot to learn from Aboriginal peoples who've lived through the destruction of their culture and survived. And radical hope is retaining hope when all hope seems to be gone. And that human capacity to retain hope when hope seems to be gone is a crucial aspect of human character, which Lear focuses upon, and I think makes it it's a wonderful book.
Sounds interesting. Michael Ignatieff, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for all of you to listen to this episode. If you liked it, please subscribe. Goodbye.